Hello, my dear Franken-friends, and welcome to Spookyou, your one-stop shop for all things ghastly and ghoulish. I'm your host, Barnabas Vixen, and tonight we've got a special treat for you all. We're bringing you the HD remaster of one of our more popular series. That's right, Unalive, in color, and all in one video this time. It's I Woke Up to an Emergency Alert on My Phone. Now There's Creatures Outside by Reddit user VoidedConscience. Hey, we even got fancy and decided to add some moving pictures to it this time, rather than the old Spookyou loop that you may so fondly remember. So strap in, set your phones on silent, and let your mind slowly drift away while our vivacious voiceover virtuoso takes over from here. I'll see all of you later. I woke up to an emergency alert at 6 a.m. this morning on my phone. Checking my phone, the alert read, "Go indoors immediately and remain inside. Await further instructions." After living here for almost 10 years, I've only ever received a handful of emergency alerts, which all presented themselves as tests for the emergency alert system. Generally, I live my life pretty freely and don't take life too seriously, but unfortunately for me, this means that I'm not the type of person who prepares for the worst to happen, which I now realize is what I should have been doing. I thought to myself, better safe than sorry, so after getting out of bed, I immediately headed downstairs and checked that both the front and back doors were locked and deadbolted. I live alone and always lock my doors at night, but I needed to verify this simply for my sanity's sake, even if I didn't know exactly what was going on. I live in a decently sized 2-story house that I've worked my ass off to make a reality, and the windows downstairs all have solid security screens on them, meaning there was no need for me to check the locks on those. After securing the house, I went back upstairs to my bedroom and tried to make a couple of calls. Initially, I called my boss, and I couldn't just expect to get the day off work without explaining the situation, if there even was a situation. The phone rang for some time before directing me to her voicemail system. I left a message explaining the emergency alert I received and told her to call me back when she gets the chance so we can discuss what's happened. I tried calling my parents, but was again sent straight to their voicemail system. I think at this point was when I was starting to get worried. My parents live almost 2 hours away from me and were always awake at the ass crack of dawn. They never left the house before 8 a.m., but I still tried to convince myself they were busy with something else. So again, I left a message for them to get back to me when they could. My phone dinged. A message from one of my work colleagues, John. He was asking whether I had received the emergency alert too and if I knew anything about why it had sent out. I replied immediately and told him that I didn't know any more than he did, but I'd let him know if I found anything out. Besides, I needed to calm down now. There was no use worrying over something yet that I didn't even know about. I decided to shower first before having a quick breakfast and turning on the television to get my mind off of whatever could be going on. At this point, it was about 7:30 a.m., the time I would usually be leaving for work. Now, I'm not one to purposely ignore warning signs, so I'd rather get an angry text from my boss than get caught up in whatever caused the emergency alert to be sent in the first place. When I turned the television on, the same emergency alert sound invaded my ears. The volume was so high from the music I was listening to last night that I had to dive for the remote to turn it down. And the same words that my phone woke me up to were the only words on the screen. Go indoors immediately and remain inside. Await further instructions. Now, I was extremely worried. I was realizing that this couldn't just be an accident or a test. I'd never seen an emergency warning like this, let alone it being presented on every channel I flicked through. Without any additional information, there was no way for me to know what was going on or how to prepare for it. And after turning the volume from the television all the way down to get a break from the blaring alert sound, I realized just how quiet it was outside. I mean, there was no cars commuting, birds chirping, neighbors chatting, or airplanes flying overhead. Nothing. I never realized how accustomed I had become to these background sounds, and this lack of background sound made me feel incredibly uneasy, like like I could sense something was wrong regardless of the emergency alerts. Now, all of my blinds were still shut, so I hadn't had a chance or even thought about looking outside until this point. There wasn't any specific instructions regarding looking outside anyway, so I didn't really think anything of it, but I thought it would be safest to look outside my bedroom window, which leads out to a small balcony through a sliding glass door. I went into my room and pulled on the string that rotates the vertical blinds, and immediately my room flooded with natural light and the warmth of the sun hit me. I've always loved the warmth of direct sunlight, so I made sure my window was faced towards the sunrise and subsequently towards the street when I had the house built. However, after opening the blinds, what I saw made me immediately drop to the floor out of sight from the street. I barely got a glimpse of them, but they looked extremely hostile. These creatures were nothing like any animal I've ever seen and were gathered in a circle in front of the house across from mine. It looked like there were about 8 of them. They were all gaunt and tall and appeared as though they were wearing a suit of skin that was far too tight for their body. Their bones seemed to be almost protruding from their skin. They had no facial features besides a pair of dark, sunken eyes that appeared completely white in contrast with their extremely dark skin. These things were far from human, but were standing on 2 legs like us. I'm glad they didn't see me. If they can see at all, that is. I don't think I'd be writing this right now if they had seen me. After dropping to the floor, I immediately closed the blinds again, and I've never had a panic attack before now, but now realizing the actual danger I was in, it sure felt like I was going through something similar. Nothing that was going on was normal. Without confidence, I dialed the emergency telephone number on my phone. Immediately, a recorded message sounded through the speaker. Go indoors immediately and remain inside. Await further instructions. This message pierced my ears and continued looping until I ended the call. A couple of hours passed by while I went through my entire phone list trying to get into contact with anyone I possibly could. Now even John wouldn't respond. Not a single person answered their phone or responded to the frantic voicemails I left. At the moment, I was safe in my house, but how long would that last? I didn't even know what these creatures were, let alone what they were capable of. I just knew that they weren't here to make friends. Eventually, I decided to make my way downstairs and take stock of the food that I had. I don't know how long I'll have to wait these creatures out, but the power is still working at the moment, so everything in the fridge and freezer is still okay. The water is still running, obviously, since I was able to take a shower, but again, I don't know how long that will last. I decided to fill up the bathtub in the downstairs bathroom in case the water stops running anytime soon, so I'll have at least 150 liters of drinkable water in that case. Curiosity got the better of me. After taking stock of the food and filling the tub, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already going a little mad. I mean, just yesterday, everything had been completely fine, and now I couldn't get in touch with a single person, and there were creatures out on the street that I'd never seen before. I needed to look again. I needed to know that what I saw was real, and not something that I had made up in my head. This all felt like a weird dream I needed to wake up from, but I knew this was real. I went back upstairs to my bedroom and peeked through the blinds. Surprisingly, the creatures were no longer where I'd seen them earlier. And I then noticed the door to the house across the street looked to have been scratched through. There were long scratch marks along the length of the wooden door and a large hole in the center. They'd broken their way into that house, but they were no longer anywhere to be seen. That is, until I noticed something staring straight back at me through the upstairs window of that same house. The deep, sunken eyes I stared into seemed like they'd steal the soul from my body if I looked for too long. And after my brain recognized what I was staring at, I leapt backwards away from the blinds. That thing had no doubt seen me, and I paced back and forth thinking of what I should do at this point when I heard a horrendous sound coming from downstairs. I quietly made my way down the stairs and towards the sound. The sound pierced my ears. It sounded like something sharp being dragged across metal, and that's when I realized that they were trying to get inside. The metal security screen door I had installed was being barraged by them. I started moving the bookcases I had by the entrance against the front door. Now the sun was setting and they were mercilessly going at it. There was no way I could fend off these things barehanded. And that's when I remembered the gift that my dad had given me this year for my 25th birthday. I was never really into guns and never really had a need to use one, but at a time like this, it was quite necessary if it had to come to that. So I ran back upstairs and into the guest room where I'd stored everything that was gifted to me for my birthday this year. The pistol was still in its case, and I quickly removed it and loaded it with ammunition that my dad had shown me how to use. I've never fired a gun, so this still remains a last resort. Now I'm sitting in my room writing this. The pistol is sitting on my bedside table, and I can still hear those creatures downstairs. I don't know exactly what I should do. Should I run? Should I fight? If you're reading this, please respond. So, it's been a couple of days since my last post, and a lot has happened. On a positive note, I'm not dead yet. However, I'm in a new predicament now. I need to post this as a record of what has happened here, and I'll start from where I left off in my previous post. That hideous sound from the front door downstairs did not let up, and I needed to decide whether I would find somewhere safe to hide within the house or make a run for it while those creatures were preoccupied at the door. Both of these options had downsides. If I decided to stay in the house and hide, I'd find myself trapped should they find me. But if I decided to run, there's no way of knowing how well they are at tracking or even how many more of them are outside. I also have no experience shooting a gun, so I felt as though an enclosed environment would give me the best chance of landing a shot should it come to that. But then again, there's no telling whether a bullet would even stop them or not. I do have an attic that I would hope be difficult to reach by those creatures. The opening is in the second bedroom and requires a ladder to get up. Fortunately, I painted that room earlier in the year and borrowed a ladder from my father, which I kind of forgot to return to him. With this plan in my head, I immediately put it into action. I needed to gather food and water before going up there, but I didn't know how much time I had left before they broke through the door and makeshift barricade. The bottom of the stairs are right by the front door, so if I couldn't get back to the stairs in time, I'd be dead for sure. So I grabbed the pistol that had been sitting beside me and bolted downstairs, and then I realized that these creatures weren't just bombarding the front door. The sound of metal scratching on metal came from the windows too. Never have I ever been so thankful that I had security screens installed on those windows too, but I couldn't imagine they would hold up for much longer. Now I had no time to screw around, so with haste I headed towards the kitchen. A lot of the food was still on the counter from when I was taking stock, and I grabbed a couple of shopping bags from the pantry and scooped whatever I could from the counter and filled the bags. Not forgetting to grab the can opener, I grabbed it too from the utensil drawer. I predicted all the food I had would last me about 2 weeks if I stretched it out, but I didn't have time to gather everything, and I wouldn't be making a second trip down here anytime soon. And water was more important anyways. Without water, I wouldn't even last a week. The only thing I could think of was to fill all the water bottles I had and hope that they would last me until these creatures moved on. I rummaged through the cupboards and found 4 different water bottles of varying sizes and filled them at the tap as fast as I could before throwing them in the bags with the food. These bags were heavy now. I placed the pistol in my waistband and lifted the bags, running towards the staircase, and a loud crash came from the kitchen window behind me, not like what I'd already been hearing. It sounded like one of them had gotten through the security screen, and I didn't have time to look back, and honestly, I was too scared to. Hoping that I'd make it in time, I dashed up the stairs as fast as I could and ran straight for the spare bedroom. I slammed the door behind me and quickly locked it, knowing full well that a thin bedroom door would not stop these things. I dropped the bags and grabbed the ladder that was lying on the ground. And lining it up with the attic opening, I climbed up and moved the panel covering the opening. More loud crashes and heavy footsteps on the wooden floors could be heard from downstairs. There wasn't much time left. I grabbed the bags and lifted them into the attic with all the strength I could muster, and this is when I realized I'd left my phone in my bedroom. I felt like I needed it in case anybody tried to contact me, but I clearly wasn't in the right state of mind at the time. So without even thinking, I climbed down the ladder away from the safest place I could hope to be right now and swung the door open about to bolt for my bedroom, stupidly thinking I still had the time to spare. The figure I saw at the bottom of the staircase stunned me, and I froze for a second. My mind told me to scream, but it was like I was paralyzed and nothing came out of my mouth. Its eyes stared wide, the same eyes I had stared into from the window across the street. And suddenly, the figure lunged towards me up the stairs and I snapped out of it. I ran backwards into the spare room and slammed the door closed again. The creature made contact with the door and a loud thump sound resonated in my ears from the impact. I pounced at the ladder and scurried up through the opening. I don't know how smart they are, but my mind told me that I needed to pull the ladder up or they definitely know that I'm up here. I leaned over the opening and reached for the ladder. Grabbing it firmly, I heaved it upwards and backwards. This ladder wasn't light, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins must have helped as I pulled it up into the attic. Vicious scratching sounds came from the bedroom door, and just as I placed the panel over the opening, the sound of the door being caved in boomed. I held my breath and closed my eyes in the dark. I could hear the creature below me, scurrying around and destroying everything in the room. It would have torn me apart if it had caught me, and I'm sure of that. Soon I could hear the other creatures making their way up the staircase and into the room too. And the fact that they made no vocal sound unsettled me, like a silent serial killer without a mask, but I'm not sure I'd rather be listening to whatever visceral sound they would make if they had mouths. The only thing I could do from here on out was wait. Wait until they settled down or lost interest and keep as quiet as possible. I didn't move an inch for a few hours and continued listening to the rampage happening below me. I had no way of knowing how good their hearing was, and I was in no rush to find out. So I silently prayed that my phone would survive the ordeal so I wouldn't be completely isolated if there was a chance of contacting someone, and internally reprimanded myself for being so stupid enough to forget it. I had no way of knowing what time it was exactly, but a glimpse of sunlight shone through the small window in the attic, signifying dawn was upon us. I had survived the night, and for that I was thankful. I could still hear faint sounds coming from the house below, but the creature's rampage had subsided for the most part. So as quiet as I could, I grabbed a snack bar out of one of the bags and drank from one of the bottles I had filled. Only now realizing how thirsty I was when the lukewarm water that I would usually only drink ice cold met my lips. I gulped down about half the bottle before I could stop myself. I didn't want to risk going down anytime soon, so I stayed up in the attic for the entire day. I actually felt relatively safe, and I assumed they didn't know I was up here since I'm sure they would have joined me by now if they did, but I couldn't stay up here forever. I still needed to get my phone for obvious reasons, if it hadn't been destroyed yet. That is. I eventually passed out from exhaustion, I think, since I don't really remember purposefully laying my head down to rest, despite waking up knowing that time had definitely passed and having my bladder screaming at me to release its contents, though there obviously isn't a toilet in the attic, so I'll spare you those details. Needless to say, I remained as quiet as possible. Eventually, I realized I could no longer hear any sound coming from the house below. But getting down and back up again wouldn't be a walk in the park since I'd need to use the ladder again, and staying anywhere else in the house clearly wasn't safe with what I can only guess the state of the windows and doors being in shambles. Luckily though, if the phone had survived, it would only be in the next room over where I'd left it. I decided to wait a few more hours before executing the retrieve and retreat again plan. Slowly, I removed the panel from the attic opening and quietly surveyed the spare bedroom below. Everything looked to have been torn to shreds, and I can only imagine what would have happened had I taken just a few moments too long to get up into the attic. Whilst the room was a mess, there was no sign of the creatures in the direct vicinity. I poked my head out further and peeked towards the bedroom door. Well, what was left of it at least. Again, no sign of them. Still, I couldn't hear a thing from downstairs, so I quietly moved the ladder and lowered it down slowly. I made sure to hold the pistol tight while climbing down the ladder as light-footed as I could and made my way to the doorway. The bottom of the stairs looked clear too, but I wasn't going to risk going down there right now. I crept towards the open doorway that was once my bedroom door and surveyed the room silently, trying to locate my phone. My bed had been turned upwards, and clothes from my closet that had been hanging neatly were now strewn across the floor with plenty of ferocious slashes through them. Finally, I located my phone. It seemed odd that it was sitting so perfectly on top of my favorite jacket, but I grabbed it and turned towards the doorway. That's when I saw the creature rise onto 2 legs through my balcony window, like it had been waiting for me in a crouched position. Once again, the creature stared at me for a moment with its deep, sunken, wide eyes, but without thinking, I aimed the pistol at the creature and pulled the trigger. The sound of the glass shattering made a deafening sound and I fell backwards. I didn't know if I hit the creature or not, but I needed to get back into the attic now if I had any chance of getting out of this unscathed. The sound of the gun would surely alert the others. I knew this, so I immediately got to my feet and started back towards the attic opening. I glanced at where the creature had been a second ago, but it wasn't there anymore. Assuming I had hit it, I made my way back to the spare room and hurried up the ladder with my phone in my back pocket. The sound of the creatures galloping up the stairs surprised me, and I glanced toward the staircase from the open doorway. They saw me this time. I hurtled up into the attic and kicked the ladder out from under myself, and I quickly moved the panel back over the opening and threw the heavy bags on top of it, hoping to weigh it down. Immediately, the pounding began. Pulling my phone out of my back pocket, I unlocked the screen. Another emergency alert flashed on the screen and it said, "Seek nearest bomb shelter immediately. Saturation bombing inbound. ETA 1500, 3 p.m. The clock on my phone showed the time as 12:30 p.m. If you're reading this right now, please respond. Just a brief reminder to check out Voided Conscience on Reddit. There you can find more of his stories to consume, and give him a follow to show your support. I mean, without these authors, videos like this just wouldn't be possible. I mean, do you think we have a full writer's room here in the studio? I'm just gonna let you think on that while we return you to this story. Reading the emergency alert on my phone, my heart sunk. I had just 2.5 hours to make it to the nearest bomb shelter. With those creatures relentlessly pounding on the attic access panel and only the small attic window as an escape option, my chances of making a safe escape stood at almost 0%. But I wasn't about to give up. The nearest bomb shelter I knew of was nowhere near where I lived. With no way of knowing how many of those creatures were roaming around outside, I wouldn't stand a chance of making it there on foot. I'd need a car, but my car is in the garage and my keys were, in a bowl where I always leave them by the front door. It would be far too risky to go back into the house if I managed to escape, as I'm sure I would need time to find them considering the state of just my bedroom, and time is something I just don't have a lot of. Thinking through the different scenarios in my head, immediately I remembered one of my neighbors, Craig, stopping me on a morning run a while back and telling me about how he preps for the end of the world, something I definitely thought he was crazy for at the time, and forgot about almost completely not long after he told me. I never thought anything like this would ever happen. He told me he had a bunker installed under his house about a year ago with enough food to last a family of 4 for a year, despite him living alone. His house is a couple down from mine, but I never actually saw anything being installed. At this point, though, this was the only chance I had at making it somewhere survivable before the bombs hit. I needed to get out of this place ASAP, and I had only one option of getting out of the attic. Immediately, I made my way over to the attic window. It was small, but slid open in its entirety from the bottom, so I guessed I could manage to squeeze out. Luckily, I never had security bars installed on it. I needed to do this without alerting any of those creatures if there were still any outside the house. Whether they could climb or scale the house or not, I prayed for the latter. I popped the window open slightly and peeked out. The window faced towards the neighbor's house and in the same direction I needed to go. The way the house was designed meant I could lower myself onto the roof of the lower level of the house once I got outside and not have to drop all the way to the ground and probably seriously injure myself in the process. From the window, I couldn't immediately see any of the creatures in the vicinity. So I forced the window open as far as it could go and propped my leg up and out. Once one of my legs were out, I hunched down and moved the rest of my body through the opening, followed by my other leg. Holding onto the windowsill, I faced the wall and lowered myself slowly till my feet met the roof of the lower floor. The roof tiling was solid, but I didn't trust myself enough to not slip and fall off, so I lowered my body onto all fours and crouched down. From here, I could definitely be seen from the street whether I was crouching or not, so I immediately moved further towards the back of the house. I guessed it would be a lot more likely that there would be more of those creatures on the street rather than my backyard. And I was right. I scanned the backyard from my vantage point and didn't see any of the creatures. However, I could still hear the creatures pounding on the attic panel, which would likely attract more of those things, if they were even attracted to sound. This also meant those ones were still preoccupied and I still had time before they figured out I wasn't up there anymore. I carefully made my way towards the gutter pipe, which traversed the length of the house from top to bottom, and made one final scan before lowering myself onto it. Sliding down the pipe, I tried my best to stay quiet. However, the worst thing that could possibly happen at that point occurred. The fixtures that secured the pipe into the wall came loose. And as the screws tore from the wall, the pipe along with me came crashing down onto the concrete pavement. Slamming into the ground, the air immediately left my lungs. I tried breathing in again, but I couldn't. And I knew I had no time to mess around and those creatures would have likely heard the commotion. I managed my way to my feet and forced myself toward the side of the house, away from the back door. At this point, my breath came back to me, but the pain in my back ached immensely, and I collapsed against the house. That fall definitely left a mark, and if this were any other time, I would probably have laid down and called for help, but help wasn't coming. I realized the pounding sound from the attic I had been hearing had stopped, and my heart sunk once more. They were coming. I picked myself up again and started moving again. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins and knew a wasted second could be the difference between surviving this ordeal and being torn apart in a few moments. I needed to stay out of sight, so my first instinct was to scale the fence in front of me. The pain in my back throbbed, but my will to live grew stronger, and I jumped up and grabbed the top of the fence, holding on tightly. Pulling myself up, I thanked myself for working out regularly, which granted me increased upper body strength. I propped a leg up onto the fence and worked to pull the rest of my body up and over. My way down on the other side, however, was far from graceful. And as I pulled my body over the fence, my descent was halted as my shoe got caught on a loose screw protruding from the top of the fence. Tugging on my shoe, it came loose from the nail and I fell into a bush directly below me on the other side of the fence. While my descent wasn't exactly graceful, it also wasn't too loud. However, this was no time to be hopeful, and I immediately brought myself to my feet and moved towards my next-door neighbor's house. It was probably safer to move between backyards scaling fences than it was to expose myself on the street, where other creatures likely lay waiting. Craig's house was just the next one over, so I wasn't far now, and I could hear the creatures scurrying around in my backyard behind the fence I had climbed. They weren't smashing through the fence or jumping over it yet, so I thanked my lucky stars. I didn't know the family who lived directly next to me, but the state of the house left little to the imagination about their fate. This house had the same security features as mine from what I could see, but most of the back windows were broken, and the screen door looked like it had been completely torn open like mine. But the house stood silent right now. I moved towards the fence on the opposite side of the yard, the one they shared with Craig, and quickly peeked over after scanning down the side of the house for any of the creatures. The coast was still clear, but a wave of despair rushed over me when I saw that Craig's house, too, had taken a beating. It seemed like no house on my street had been left untouched at this point, and I was just one of the lucky ones who was targeted last. Without knowing the full behavior of these creatures, there could very well be one of them still lurking inside his house. And it also dawned on me that it was likely Craig had already entered and sealed the bunker he had built for exactly this type of scenario. Whether or not this was the case, it was still my last hope, and I'd rather die trying than die doing nothing at all. Whilst his house was beaten like the others on the street, Craig's yard was clear. I made my way over the fence like I had the other, but this time being more careful not to get snagged on anything. I stayed low to the fence, not wanting the creatures in my yard or anywhere else to catch a glimpse of me, and landed safely on the other side with a quiet thud on the bare dirt. The house was about the same size as mine, but I'd never actually been inside, so the location of Craig's bunker was still to be determined. The upside of his house already being invaded meant that I wouldn't have to do any breaking and entering myself, just entering. The back door had been torn completely off its hinges and lay on the ground outside the entrance. I moved towards the house and listened carefully for any sounds inside. The only sound I could hear was a banging from the direction of my house. And that's when I realized it sounded like the creatures were pounding on the fence I had first scaled. I don't know what caused them to come in this direction, maybe just dumb luck, but I knew it wouldn't be long before they made their way towards me. I removed the handgun from my belt and raised it in front of me before moving swiftly into the open doorway with light footsteps, avoiding making unnecessary sounds that would likely be heard from anyone or anything that remained here. My plan was to look for the basement. I guess this was the most likely place a hidden bunker would be situated inside a house. The back door entryway led directly into a laundry area where shattered glass was strewn across the floor. Directly connected to this was the kitchen, which I scoped out carefully before entering. The glass on the floor made me very cautious of where I placed my foot, and the large pieces of glass would likely not be quiet if shattered further. A loud sound bellowed from outside, making my heart skip a beat. It sounded as if the fence had been bowled over and hit the ground. I had no time to waste if they were getting closer already. I quickly moved through the kitchen and made my way into an open living room. The furniture had been completely torn apart, and the floor was littered with bits and pieces of wood, glass, and other miscellaneous materials. A number of doors led out of this room, any of which could be hiding a way down. However, a door in the corner had clearly been torn through, leaving a large creature-sized gap in its wake. I made the assumption that this was likely where Craig had fled to, which hopefully meant that this was the way down to a basement of some sort. More cautiously than ever, I walked towards the battered door. As I entered the room, the lack of light caused my eyes to readjust. A staircase leading down was the first sign that I had been right. I stood silently for a while my eyes slowly adjusted themselves to the darkness. There was no use going into a basement that I couldn't see a thing in. When I could make out the bottom of the staircase, I carefully moved down the staircase, and when I was halfway down the staircase, I saw it. Human remains covered the floor. Blood splatters covered the walls and the ceiling, and a large pool of blood was situated in the corner of the room where Craig's mangled body laid. Huge pieces of flesh had been torn out. My stomach turned as I doubled over, dropping my gun and forcefully expelling the small amounts of food I had consumed earlier. The sight was horrific, and I could not believe that I had actually seen something so graphic. The world around me went mute for a moment as I processed the situation, but a deafening bang came from above and snapped me out of the daze. The sight of Craig's body had narrowed my vision, but what appeared to be a solid metal door that was slightly ajar came into view near where his body remained. He was just a little too late, and I sprinted towards the door and slammed my body into it, opening it wide enough to fit through. Something clattered down the stairs behind me, and I glanced back and once again saw a gross creature and its large eyes staring deep into my soul. It was coming towards me faster than I had imagined, and my gun remained at the bottom of the staircase where I'd so foolishly dropped it. Without thinking, I heaved the door closed with all the strength I could muster and spun the handle. The sound of the creature slamming into the door could be heard as the metal bolts locked the door in place. It's been a while. I heard the bombs drop about an hour after my last post. The bunker shook so hard I thought it was going to collapse on me, but after the last explosion, the walls and the ceiling remained solid. Without Craig and his prepper tendencies, I wouldn't be alive right now. I didn't know him too well, but I can't let his death be in vain. When I first got here, the creatures continued pounding on the door relentlessly, but to my relief, none of them had managed to make their way into the bunker before I did. After the final bomb dropped, the outside world went silent. From inside the bunker, it seemed like the creatures hadn't even made a dent in the thick metal door that separated me from them. After hours of listening for any activity outside the door, I collapsed onto the bed. Craig had installed a single cot, which wasn't particularly comfortable, but with the sense of a seemingly safe environment to lay down in and the fact that it was a hell of a lot more comfortable than the wooden floor in the attic, I managed to fall asleep. I had vivid nightmares of the creatures that night and woke up in a cold sweat. I opened my eyes and was looking directly up at the ceiling. I tried to lift my head, but something stopped me. My body was stiff and rejected every signal I gave it to move. It felt heavy, like gravity had increased tenfold, and I was stuck. That's when I noticed, in the corner of my eye, the dark figure that stood in the opposite corner of the room. Its shadow cast by the small battery-operated light on the wall next to me. I struggled to make out who or what it was that had found its way into this safe place I thought I had secured. The figure started moving towards me and my heart skipped a beat. The figure's face became illuminated by the light and its huge sunken eyes stared back into mine. I wanted to scream. I wanted to jump out of the bed I was helplessly lying in and do something about the situation I'd found myself in, but the closer the creature got to me, the less control I felt I had over my own body. Its tall form reached higher than most professional basketball players, with its head nearly touching the bunker's relatively low ceiling. At this range, I could make out more details about the creature. Tightly bound to its thin body, the creature's dark skin appeared charred. Its huge eyes remained the only recognizable characteristic on its face, and its long, sharp, finger-like claws taunted me. The creature arched its head down towards me, and its face grew closer to mine. It felt as though the creature were sucking the soul from my body. The sheer terror I felt and the malicious force the creature exuded forced me to squeeze my eyes closed and wait for the inevitable to occur. But nothing happened. Moments passed and I waited. Still nothing. I opened my eyes again and the creature was gone. I tried to get off the bed and finally my body responded. The weight that held me down had suddenly lifted. Completely shaken, I examined the place the creature had been before I closed my eyes and found no trace. The creature had vanished. Or maybe it was never there in the first place. But it felt so real. I've never experienced sleep paralysis before, but those creatures had an unimaginable effect on my psyche, it seemed. I couldn't continue sleeping after that ordeal. I got up completely and made the bed. I decided to take an inventory of what Craig had bought for this place. He wasn't lying about the amount of food that he had stockpiled. While it wasn't anything fancy or particularly tasty, it got the job done, and honestly, beggars can't be choosers. A huge water tank had been installed in the bunker, which was completely full of potable water. The lights in the bunker were powered by rechargeable batteries, and Craig had obviously never wanted this place to go dark because there were enough in here to last a lifetime. I estimated that if I rationed correctly, I could live for at least a year in the bunker with these supplies. I didn't really have a clue on what to expect about the size and contents of the bunker before getting there. All that mattered before was getting to the bunker in one piece, literally. The size of the bunker was adequate for a single person, about 4 by 4 meters, consisting of a single living space with everything needed for long-term survival located in the one room. From the bunker door located in the center of the south wall, the bed I slept on prior was situated in the adjacent right corner of the room. The toilet was located in the opposite corner adjacent to the north and east walls, along with all the miscellaneous medical supplies. In the far left corner, adjacent to the north and west walls, was the large water tank, and next to that was where Craig had stored the food supplies in countless numbers of large, sturdy containers that towered over me. Additionally, the clothes located in the other corner, adjacent to the south and west wall, were my size, so it meant I wouldn't need to sit and bathe in my own filth while seeking refuge here. Fortunately, Craig was obviously a meticulous prepper, as almost every container and compartment was labeled with exactly what it contained. After moving a few of the containers that lined the walls, to my surprise, I stumbled upon one labeled weaponry. I didn't know what to expect inside, but I prayed that there would be something that could replace the pistol I so stupidly dropped at the bottom of the basement stairs before coming in here. Carefully lifting the lid, the contents of the container revealed itself to me. Inside laid a pistol. It appeared to be a smaller model to the one I'd lost, but guns were, and definitely still, aren't my forte. A box full of ammunition was positioned next to the gun, in addition to a decently sized sheathed hunting knife. I picked up the knife and removed it from its sheath. The sharp blade looked brand new and was about 6 inches long, not that it would be much use against the creatures anyways. I would be torn apart before I could even get close enough to land a single hit with it, but regardless, it was better than no melee weapon at all. I definitely thought I had the mental ability to stay isolated for a long period of time, but after a single day, I felt like those creatures were getting into my head. Humans are social creatures, and I'm afraid I'll go crazy in here alone, especially considering what I saw when I woke up. I would physically be safe here, but staying here alone for a long period of time seemed just as bad as facing the new reality that was outside. If I can't even go a single night without seeing those creatures, the bunker would be the end of me and my mental health if I wasn't careful. It was hard to tell what was going on outside the safety of the bunker. Not only could I not hear anything, I also had no signal on my phone since entering, and Craig obviously didn't plan on contacting the outside world when shit hit the fan, because I wasn't able to find any form of radio that would work in a place like this. However, it was important for me to find out the fate of everyone else. I couldn't be the only survivor. It was almost as if something was compelling me to leave the bunker. The dreams and the visions I'd had led me to believe that something didn't want me to stay in the shelter and safety of the secure bunker. I convinced myself that I could always return here if necessary, but getting to a bunker where there are other people and a community to develop would be an ideal situation. I decided to wait over a week before making this decision. The days in the bunker dragged on, and without a sense of day and night, I constantly felt like I was on the edge of going crazy. An irrational fear grew inside me. The nightmares and visions of the creatures became worse, but always ended before they offed me for real. Something wasn't right here, and I was itching to get out. If the creatures were waiting for me outside the bunker, I would be torn apart in minutes. But I had to believe that the bombs that were deployed wiped a large portion of them out. However many there were to begin with. Regardless, I needed to know, and I had a firearm once again to back me up. I found a high-quality bug-out bag already pre-packed with essential equipment during my stay here, which included a portable water filter and canteen, fire starters, medical gear, a change of clothes, a few MREs, a torch, navigation tools, a multi-tool, and a tarp. Needless to say, this made the choice of what to bring with me a lot easier. Additionally, despite the hunting knife I found earlier being a seemingly useless weapon against these creatures, it provided some peace of mind for whatever reason, and I decided to carry it along too, as well as the pistol and ammunition found with it. I was as prepared as I would ever be, and whether I stayed in the bunker or not, my fate would likely remain the same if those creatures still remained outside. If they survived those bombs, how the hell am I supposed to do the job? The plan was to get out of the bunker safely, find a form of transport, get to the nearest communal bomb shelter where I would likely find any remaining survivors, and when it's safe, I would come back and take all the supplies from the bunker. With the backpack on my back, a stomach full of as much food and water I could fit, and the pistol in front of me, ready to fire at anything that moved when I opened the door, I turned the handle and heard the bolts release. My nerves began to kick in, but what waited ahead of me, I needed to discover. Pulling the door, it cracked open and a cold draft hit me. Opening it further, I inspected the room, which was dark but seemingly empty. I guessed it was still dawn outside, and I looked at my phone to check the time. It buzzed in my hand and the vibration startled me. It was another emergency alert. Just a brief reminder to check out Voided Conscience on Reddit. There you can find more of his stories to consume, and give him a follow to show your support. I mean, without these authors, videos like this just wouldn't be possible. I mean, do you think we have a full writer's room here in the studio? I'm just gonna let you think on that while we return you to this story. The emergency alert that had appeared on my phone screen read, "The creatures have been eradicated. Any remaining survivors should seek aid at the nearest communal bomb shelter." My mind eased as I read the words. It seemed as though the bombs had actually worked, and from where I stood, the coast was clear. I looked back at the bunker, and my mind went back to the things I'd seen during my stay in there. There was no way I could live the rest of my life in there. The only thing left for me to do would be to obey the message. The nearest communal bomb shelter was located relatively far from my current location, and the trek on foot would be far from ideal. I needed to find a working vehicle that had not been affected by the bombs or some other means of transport. However, if the alert was true, walking would definitely be a possibility. I stepped out of the bunker and the cool morning air hit me again. I guessed that Craig's house above me no longer stood in its entirety, otherwise I would not have been feeling a gust of wind in his basement. The gun I had dropped before entering the bunker, that had landed on the ground at the bottom of the staircase, was no longer anywhere to be seen. The weirdest part about this situation, though, is that Craig's body was missing too. The pool of blood where he had been laying remained, but what was left of him had been moved elsewhere or simply vanished. It was exceptionally weird that the gun and Craig's body would be missing. But these creatures had used a bait trick on me once before, so I decided it would be better to forget about that gun and solely rely on the one I had obtained in the bunker, if I happened to still need it. Regardless, I didn't want to stay by the door of the bunker for much longer, and I could only rely on the correctness of what the emergency alert had told me. There was no telling whether the creatures had silently returned or remained here for some time since the bombs had dropped, if they were actually still alive and lurking. I moved towards the staircase, which seemed to be unharmed by the bombs. The entire basement seemed completely intact for that matter. At the top of the stairs, the door that had once been there was no longer, and the morning light shone through. I slowly began climbing the staircase, waiting for the moment where a lurking creature would pounce on me and end my life. But as I reached the top and peeked out of the doorway, not a single sound could be heard. The house around me was in shambles. The ceiling and walls had been severely damaged, leaving only a skeleton of what this place once was behind. But without a creature in sight, now was a better time to move than ever. I slowly moved towards what was once a perfectly intact window, but now just a frame which faced the street. Through the window, I could see that it was not only Craig's house that had been severely damaged, but every other house within my line of sight and all of the surrounding foliage was in a similar state. Anything that could survive the impact of the bombs that were dropped would have to be superhuman. There was no way that any normal living being could come out of something like that unscathed. At this point, I realized that the likelihood of me finding a functioning vehicle near my location would be next to none, and without the keys to a random person's car that was safely tucked away in their garage, it would be useless. To get there by foot, it would take at least an hour, maybe even 2, depending on the speed I would be traveling. I needed to have faith that there really were no creatures remaining on the surface, or I wouldn't last very long in the outside world. My only other option was returning to the bunker, which would cause me to spiral further into losing my mind, and there was no way I was doing that if there was hope that other survivors waited for me. Human company is what I so desperately needed. Without much of a thought, I decided to cautiously leave the remains of what was once Craig's house and head in the direction of the communal bomb shelter, where I pleaded only survivors would meet me. Human survivors, that is. The sounds of birds chirping and the other background noise that we get so accustomed to was eerily absent, and the charred buildings and foliage gave the neighborhood a mute tone. I thought about humming to myself while walking to my destination, but the thought of a lone remaining creature hearing me from somewhere it had been hiding during the bombs forced me to keep my mouth closed and travel with a light step. Moving towards the shelter, I kept a firm grip on my gun and remained on high alert, continuously scanning my surroundings. I prayed to not see a creature peer from a broken window or from around the next corner, and that I would never have the misfortune of looking one of those creatures in the eyes again. The eyes of those creatures had already been scarred into the back of my mind. I thought back to the first time I had locked eyes with one of them through my neighbor's window. Even the image in my head caused me to feel extremely paranoid, almost as though I was being watched from afar or stalked, but there was no obvious signs that this was actually the case. About 3/4 of the way to the shelter, I began letting my guard down. I almost completely convinced myself that there truly were no creatures remaining here, because I surely would have run into one by this point if the alert had been deceptive or inaccurate. I felt safe for the most part and holstered the gun I had been holding in my waistband to rest my arm. I glanced behind me as a simple precaution, and what met my gaze sent a shiver down my spine. A dark figure swiftly moved behind a fence a few hundred meters down the street from the direction I had come. My heart skipped a beat. There was no doubt in my mind that the figure I had just seen was one of the creatures. I froze for a moment and kept my eyes on where I had seen the creature disappear. A few moments passed, and I tried to convince myself that my mind had simply been playing tricks on me. Had I actually seen that figure, or was it just something my mind had created out of paranoia? Moments later, however, the creature's face peeked from the fence it had disappeared behind, and its eyes locked with mine like I had hoped would never happen again. My mind suddenly flooded with images of the creatures, and the image of Craig's mangled body appeared in front of me. Screaming in horror, I broke my gaze from the creature's huge, deep, sunken white eyes and swiftly turned around towards the shelter. There was no longer any doubt in my mind that I was being followed, and without looking back, I began sprinting towards the shelter faster than I had ever ran before. I couldn't hear anything behind me, but I had no desire to look back and experience what those creatures had just done to me once again, or even slow down for a second. Continuously, I braced myself with a swift slash from behind that would end my life, but was yet to come. My gun was once again grasped tightly in my hand, not wanting to drop my weapon for a second time. Sprinting had closed the gap between me and the shelter. I turned onto the street on which it was located. Now only a few hundred meters of open street stood between me and my new safe haven. The large yellow sign that declared the purpose of the building I was heading towards came into view, but I then realized that the doors to the shelter were closed and there was not a single person waiting for me outside. I had no other option but to pray that there was someone on the other side willing to open that door for me. A gut feeling took over, convincing me that the creatures were right behind me, ready to mangle my body like what was done to Craig and compelling me to turn around and look. I turned around while still moving towards the shelter door, and to my bewilderment, the coast was clear. I stopped dead in my tracks for a moment, truly debating whether or not I had already gone mad. There was no way what I had seen wasn't real. I couldn't believe that. I turned back again towards the shelter and noticed the door was open and that a man that was stood just outside of the shelter was waving me over. The man yelled at the top of his lungs for me to run. Swiftly, I checked behind me again, and what I saw made me feel as though I was going to have a heart attack right then and there. A huge horde of those creatures charged in my direction, quickly closing the gap between me and them. Purposefully, I avoided looking at their faces and without a second thought, turned on my heel and raced towards the door. The man swiftly moved back into the shelter, and for a second, I thought he would close the door before I made it inside. But to my relief, he kept it open. A moment after I stepped inside the shelter, the man slammed the door shut behind me, but a huge thud on the other side caused it to open again slightly. A barrage of loud thuds came from the other side of the door, and I slammed my body up against it, trying to close it again far enough to lock it in place. Just then, a huge effort from the creatures was made, and the door swung completely open, sending me tumbling down a staircase. Adrenaline rushed through my body, and the pain from falling down the stairs was masked by the fear that those creatures had just breached the door to this shelter. I looked up the staircase I had just descended, and to my dismay saw the creatures violently tearing apart the man's body who had helped me moments ago. All of the hope I once had was lost at this point, but I struggled to my feet and jolted towards a door that appeared to separate the entrance and exit from the main living area. Tumbling through the door, I was shocked to see dozens of other people crowded on the other side of the room. Some of these people were trembling on the ground and others were yelling complete gibberish. I quickly turned back around and slammed the door closed. This door was not one that could take much of a beating, but I believed that any time I bought could help me. Without thinking, I started dragging any furniture that wasn't bolted down in front of the door, trying to form a sort of barricade to slow the creatures down. A young girl's voice screamed from somewhere behind me, asking where her dad was. And I could only assume that her dad was the man who I had just seen die right in front of my eyes. I started yelling for the people to help me and that the creatures were going to get in here if we didn't move fast, but not a single person moved from where they were. Another loud voice bellowed from behind me, from a woman this time, blaming me for dooming them all and damning me to hell. A sudden rush of realization hit me, and I understood exactly why this had happened. Those things wanted me to come out of Craig's bunker. They wanted me to lead them to the other survivors, and that's why they had been stalking me on the way here. They were not allowing me any other option but to get to where I now was. But the emergency alert I had received, was that another one of the creature's mind tricks too? Like what I had thought I had seen while seeking refuge in the bunker. Was that really sleep paralysis or something more sinister? It was clear that the answers to these questions would remain unanswered. After piling what I could in front of the door, I moved backwards toward the other side of the room. The people behind me continued yelling at me while I looked around for any other way out of this situation. Swiftly, I spotted a door to my left that had been left slightly ajar and ran towards it, hoping for something that was never going to happen. As I swung the door open, I realized that it was only a small storage area. A loud bang came from behind me and I turned around. The furniture that I had stacked in front of the door had been sent flying across the room, and without thinking, I moved quickly into the storage area I had come upon. Screams from the other side of the door bellowed throughout the enclosed area and were soon replaced by sounds of flesh being torn apart. The storage area I'm in has no alternate exits, no way out. It won't be long until those creatures find me in here, and there's no way I have enough bullets to even cause a dent in the numbers they have. This will most definitely be my last update. The only solace I have now is the fact that I'll be saving a bullet for myself. For anyone else who receives the emergency alert that I did, I'll pray for you. Good luck. And goodbye. Welcome back, my darling deviants. Oh, I do hope you're hunkered down and barricaded nice and snug inside your room. There are faceless humanoid monsters roaming the streets, and I wouldn't want any of you to go missing before you've had a chance to incinerate that subscribe button and ring that little bell so that you're notified the moment we upload a new video. As for the monsters, just set out a nice warm cup of tea and a few slices of day-old bread. In my experience, nothing tames a roaming beast like tea and gluten. Or is it tea and salami? Is it part cheesy? It's been a while since I've seen that side of my family. Oh well, better leave something out just in case since we're running out of time here. Until next time, my ghastly gang, stay spooky.